Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Beam. I'm CIB's program director, and we're at the top of the hour uh, here, and we're just our guest speaker, Paul Chan, is
Just arriving.
just arriving. Good day, Paul.
Hello, good day. Nice to meet you.
Very nice to see you, and thanks for coming in today. I want to make sure that you can share your screen if you need to.
I think you need to make me a co-host.
I can do that, I think. Let's see here. With so many people. Let's see here. How about that? Paul, does that change some things for you?
Can you see my screen now?
Yes,
Okay.
excellent. And Paul, do you mind if we record the event and
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
we'll put it on to our okay, now we're recording again. Well, we'll go ahead and start.
Michael, I think you are muted.
Good morning, good day, everybody. We're really happy to have Professor Paul Chan with us today. He's the editor of Construction Management and Economics, a very well-respected journal in the built environment research field, and he's going to talk with us today as part of our Meet the Editors series. We welcome all of our CIB members, especially our students and our early career researchers, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion today with Professor Paul Chan. So Paul, I'll just turn it over to you, and we'll have a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and it's a delight for me to be with you today. I also saw that Professor Stephen Emmett from Building Research and Information did a session before, and there are many overlaps between what I would have said and what he said, so I'm not going to kind of repeat those old ground. As I log in, I also saw quite a number of people who are very established scholars in this room. So a lot of my talk is also pitched at pretty much early career researchers as well. I guess they are at a very productive stage of their academic career, so I'm sure they are very interested in writing articles with impact. As Michael introduced me, I'm the editor-in-chief of CME, but I'm also a professor of design and construction management in Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. So today, what I'm going to say very briefly about is the journal itself. What is it about? But I'm also very interested in this idea of impacts. I'm sure lots of people, when they select a journal, they are probably thinking, okay, does it have an impact factor? So the word impact clearly feature quite heavily in terms of what we do. But I really want to get you to think about what constitutes a significantly new contribution, and then I'm going to draw on something that I do with my colleague and also co-editor, Professor Christine Reisenen, and talk to you about the logic of the research article. And basically, this is to help you sort of maybe reflect on how and where to focus on to clarify, communicate, and convince others about your contribution. I think this is really quite important. And then, of course, we will have time for Q&A. So just maybe to kick us off, this is taken from Construction Management and Economics, the About Us website. And here there is a huge block of text. I've put in bold some of the keywords I think is really important. So typically when we talk about construction, at least in CME, there has been a long tradition of thinking about the project as the unit of analysis. but also in terms of the site production. But of course, nowadays, we are also very interested in going beyond the on-site production. So especially if we have off-site production, we are also more interested nowadays in terms of not just building the building, but what do we do with the building once it's built? And also kind of really looking at the life cycle of the built asset. So here, I think we are also very interested in the entire range of construction services. And there, I think you can see the whole life cycle management being repeated there. We are also very interested in having papers with strong theoretical positioning, and that offers also a critical, reflexive accounts on practice. So I thought I'd just highlight those few things which I think is important. And of course, I've got the website to the journal there, and I'm sure you can browse through that in your own time. But the types of papers that we typically welcome, and of course, a lot of papers tend to report on primary research, but we're not only interested in those type of papers. We are increasingly also interested, and particularly with COVID-19, we are beginning to receive a lot of review papers in the pipeline. I guess because people are also perhaps restricted in terms of what they can do to collect data. But we are also very interested in policy reviews, short research notes of a couple of thousand words, or if you have a longer note, then that could be a critical essay. Perhaps theory development papers, so papers that really challenge the ways we think about particular concepts. Book reviews, I think, are also really important because there are still books being published in the field, and it'd be really nice to kind of capture what these are. And letters. Letters are also very short pieces that can make a very important point. But we are also very open-minded. So recently we had people who said, would you be open to publishing poetry, short stories, in dialogue conversations? And I must say that we are very open to the types of papers we receive, as long as there is a clear contribution to fundamental knowledge. So you could perhaps maybe have an in dialogue conversation with key people in the sector or in your country, and you might write it up in such a way that also opens up new lines of research inquiry. And that I think would be also very valuable because it also bridges the communities of academic researchers and industry practitioners. I just want to say a few words about the editorial team. I don't do this alone. So together with these editors, we handle quite a number of papers. I will share that with you shortly. But also we have an editorial board made up of many other colleagues from around the world. I see, for instance, Professor Jan Brockner in the room. So he is also one of our editorial board members. And there are many others also that are very helpful in terms of giving advice. So some key figures to highlight again. I'm not so keen to flag up the impact factor because these move from time to time, but generally we are ranked in the top quartile. So that's the Q1 rating in a number of areas: building and construction, industrial and manufacturing engineering, and management information systems. And I think this is really telling because remember I said we move beyond on-site production. So indeed, we are not just about building and construction, but we are increasingly also part of a manufacturing process. We are also interested in services. And of course, nowadays, we are also engaging with computer science, with building information modeling, increasingly with other forms of sort of information systems, artificial intelligence. So again, you can see that we are indeed having conversations in these different areas. Just I looked at the records, and for a 1-year period, just before, so from 1st of May 2020 to 30th of April 2021, the editorial team handled 561 manuscripts. This includes new submissions as well as submissions that are going through revisions. And we made final decisions over that period on 400. And the average turnaround is 31.8 days. But please, when you submit a paper, do not write to us on day 32 and ask us about the verdict, because we tend to desk reject really quickly. And those papers that are very promising tend to take a longer time because of the revisions and the review process. But on average, I think we are trying our best. It has been a challenging year for a lot of people. So we are very grateful to the peer reviewers, but also to the authors for kind of bearing with us. And out of this, so my first thing that I would like to share with you is, as an editor-in-chief, I would really, really want to accept every paper that comes to me. Because actually, we really want a healthy field that is always growing. But you can see from these figures that we actually accept around about 10%, 10, 11%. That's pretty, I think if you listen to Professor Stephen Emmett, I think that's also a similar figure in BRNI. And we reject close to 90%. And so today I really want to share with you how to avoid the kind of desk rejection and to make sure that whatever we write and publish actually delivers impact. So some common reasons for desk reject in particular. So I think if you go back 20 years ago, maybe it was relatively easy to do a country-based report. So, the argument is, well, there are many studies on X, but X hasn't been really studied in my country, and this could actually constitute a nice contribution. But nowadays, that is not enough, unless X is really a really new thing. But typically what tends to happen is that authors say, well, this hasn't been studied in my country, so I'm basically going to learn what other countries do about X, and then I'm going to investigate in my country, and my conclusions end up saying the same things that other countries have experienced. And in a way that really doesn't challenge the status quo per se. Another very typical desk reject category are questionnaire surveys that are no more than just market polls. And they tend to be about factors, drivers, barriers, opportunities, and or challenges, typically connected to my country. And these again do not really say anything new that we don't already know if one just searches for these papers. And then there are also a lot of review of previous studies that are simply a summary of key factors without necessarily a critical analysis of past questions, theoretical assumptions, methods, and or findings. So we really want that kind of critical input to say actually what is the newness to fundamental knowledge. Because I think these above approaches do not really make a difference or in terms of impact. So I want to spend a few moments just perhaps explaining what impacts stand for. So I've taken these definitions from a very recent paper in Research Policy by Mark Reed, and you can read for yourself. So impacts here defined as demonstrable and or perceptible benefits to a whole bunch of different entities that are causally linked to research. And the two words I also want you to think about is the word significant. So what is the magnitude of the effect of the research on various people, groups, organizations? And to what extent are you also reaching out to a diverse audience? I think this is also quite important. I think we had a paper published in CME a while ago by another of my Dutch colleagues, Lienche Fokker, who says we need to zoom out to figure out what others have said and done, and then to bring that back in to zoom in into our field. And I think it's this kind of relationship that I think is important. I've got a few more slides now because I want to focus on the logic of the article, and I want to maybe share with you where I think it's important and also where the pitfalls are in papers that tend not to get accepted. simply because the significance and the reach is not as wide as it could be. So one thing I would maybe emphasize here is citations is only one type of impact. In fact, you could get papers that are cited simply because they are criticized. So I think we just have to be mindful of that too. So it's important to read the content. So now I want to share with you the typical logic of an article. And I'm going to do this by drawing a model that may look quite familiar to you, because most articles look a bit like this. It has three boxes, and the first box is the title. And the title is a really important thing to deliver impact, because nowadays when we use search engines or databases, the first thing that we see is the title. And the title will either, and I'm sure all of you, when you go to conferences, you browse through the conference program and you figure out, aha, this looks interesting. And that's usually based on the title. So a good title should really capture the audience. That's already the first impact. And a good title should include some indication of the aim of the paper, the intent, what is contained in the paper, and the scope. This is actually what are the boundaries? What does this paper not include? If you are able to put that in 8 to 10 words, this is a tall order, and actually deliver an impact so that the reader is hooked onto your paper, then I think that's really important. And sometimes paper titles that deliver an impact either have a counterintuitive finding or maybe a provocative question. So I think maybe this is something to kind of think about. And then, of course, the second box is the author. Of course, nowadays, sometimes you see the author line and you probably can figure out what is contained in the paper. And then the abstract, which summarizes the aim, method, and key finding of the study. Now, I want to then move on to the logic of the main body of the paper. And the logic follows an hourglass because it starts broad and then it narrows down to a focus and then it broadens out again. And there are two parts that normally the reviewers and the editors always question when they review papers. And that is the front end as we move from the general to the specific, and then from the specific to the general in the back end. And the front end contains the introduction and review of previous studies. The focus part has the theory and the method and the results, and the back end has the discussion and conclusions. And this principally follows the famous IMRAD model: introduction, method, results, and discussion. So I'm going to talk you through different parts now, because actually, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but generally, a lot of authors know what to write here. They know what they did, the method, and they know the results. But it is always contextualizing in the front end and the back end that always is a stumbling block. So I want to get you to think of these various moves in the paper. And typically at the beginning of the paper is like a fairy tale. Fairy tales start with either once upon a time or in a land far, far away. So they either start with a timestamp or a space stamp. And in a timestamp, typically, we don't read papers for fun. So we normally have a timestamp, like recently, there has been growing interest or there is growing concern about something. And the point about this sentence, though it looks very trivial, is far from trivial. It's to actually generate interest in a particular topic. Now, once you identify there has been growing concern over why there is so few women in construction. So I'm telling you now, this is an interesting problem. And then what happens is that you then have an elaboration of the what have we done to actually solve this issue. So we see a lot of citations. And generally what happens is a lot of authors tend to summarize what other people have done or said. And then as the reader, you're thinking, why did I spend the whole afternoon reading that? And as the author, I'm sure you probably say, why did I spend months and months writing that? So at the end of the review, it is not just a summary. There is a very important word that is very significant, but again, very trivial. And that word is however. And if you use the word however once, you really packed a punch. You really have the impact. De Jong did this, De Vries did that, Van Dijk did the other. As good as they are, however, they are not good enough. Can you see that? So there has been growing concern about the number of women in construction, why there are so few. Most studies tend to be done by women, with women, for women. However, the views of men are missing or overlooked. So what you are doing here is you are making an argument. That is why the review of previous studies is so difficult to write, because it's not just a summary. It is an argument to argue what is the question and why is this an interesting and important research question. Can you follow me so far? Okay. Once you know the question, the rest is easy, so they say. The theory and method then becomes a description and justification for how you did the study, how you answered the question, and why you did what you did. And then the results is simply to report on what did you find. That is why it is really important. It is really easy, relatively speaking, to write this very focused part. And then at the end of the paper, you always see this sentence in any paper. And that sentence is, most people think in conclusion, but actually it's far from conclusive, because in the conclusions, typically you see this sentence, which says, there is always room for more research. This is because academics are very good at justifying a lifelong career. Give us some money, we do some research, we found something. So one of the things I found in my women and men study is that the things that stop women from coming into construction are also things that are stopping men from coming into construction. Can I conclude that men and women are therefore equal? I guess the answer is no. Maybe we have over-exaggerated the differences between men and women. Let's do more research. So in the discussion and conclusions, you are also making an argument. And this argument is the so what. Okay, so far so good. It's now to my final few slides now, but I just want to capture this model in your mind. And then to think of academic papers as a chain of conversation. So when you read one paper, that paper has to engage with previous conversations, and it has to invite future conversations. And then in the middle, the theory, method, and the results is the study. So one thing to think about is that in the front end, we start with what do we know? And by the time we move to the however statement, we move to what do we not know, and hopefully in your study, what did you do to find out answers to what we do not know? And then finally, in the discussion conclusions is what else do we still not know? And this is the famous phrase, it is not about you, but it's about everyone else. If you look at the moves here, you are not important. You are only important when you are at the focused part of the paper. That's why I underlined, we start with we, and then we get to what we know, to what we do not know. And then in the discussion and conclusions, it's also still not about you. It's about what else do we need to know. Okay. Now, I have actually written this up as an editorial piece. I'm not going to go through this. These are just some prompts. I've given the reference there, so you can just chew on this in your own time. But basically, this says exactly what I said in the last couple of minutes. I want to finish with my last slide now. So maybe the first question to ask yourself is, it's not about you, but about us. So why is your research interesting academically and important societally? Okay, I always like this use of interesting questions for academics, but also important for society and industry. How have you made a difference to existing conversations? So some examples to think about. Have you challenged current thinking or methods? Have you perhaps challenged current practice? Or have you challenged current policy? And finally, if you want to write for impact, think about significance and reach, and pay attention to the front end, which is the review of previous studies, and the back end, which is the discussion of findings. Thank you.
Paul, I want to say thank you so much. That was impactful, to use your words. I think this is going to be a very highly viewed conversation in the future. I know I'm going to point my students and future students to your words. We'd love to have some questions we have over 70 folks here, Paul, live, and we will put this on our website and onto CIB's YouTube channel, and we'd love to have some questions and dialogue and for the next 15 or 20 minutes while we have Paul Chan. I really enjoyed how you challenged us, Paul, to really think about impact in different ways. And, that's, I think one piece of advice I always give folks is to think about how can we do impact might be a question. And that is to read, read other people's work and be inspired by other people's work, and read that section that has what should we do next? What do we still not know? Be great to hear from some other folks.
Michael, may I?
Of course, yes.
Yes.
Good.
Thanks, Paul, for the great presentation. It was, as Michael said, very valuable information for not only PhD students, but also for academics, because we need to revisit sometimes the basics, as you mentioned in that editorial piece. My question is with regard to your journal in a specific, considering the fact that there are many construction-related journals published by ASCE, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, and other publishers. I'm very interested to know what's the the major difference between yours and, for example, construction engineering and management, because I sometimes read articles from those journals and see some overlaps in scope, and it is understandable because different publishers are publishing those. But do you have a very specific niche for this journal?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Mirdat, and thank you for the compliments also. Um, what I would say is that it's very difficult for me to answer that question without the editors of the other journals, because I feel like it wouldn't be fair for me to say, what my journal stands for versus other journals.
Yeah.
But I would maybe give a general reflection about the field, because indeed I think that we haven't matured enough to figure out why there are so many journals in the field. And I guess from an author's point of view, they probably, I don't know, I'm just second guessing, but maybe some of you might be able to confirm or otherwise, that maybe you submit to a journal and see what happens, get the peer reviewers' comments. And if you get rejected, then you have a cascading, you send to journal A, don't get accepted, then you say, okay, I'll just submit to journal B. And then it then becomes a process of, okay, just that's trial and error. And I would like to see the field actually mature so that the journals themselves are actually clear about the differentiation. And I think in some respects, there are some differentiations. Of course, these differentiations also change with the change of the editor-in-chief, for instance. And in fact, the one last slide I didn't share with you was also the list of special issues. So maybe towards the end, I might share with you the list of special issues coming forward, because I felt that CME indeed was very much trying to become more theoretically informed, but we perhaps maybe lose sight of some of the practical challenges that we are also dealing with. So since I took on board as editor-in-chief, I've commissioned a number of special issues on construction danger and defects, on transforming construction, on building renovation, sustainability. I've also got one on what have we learned from COVID-19, and soon we will have one on construction goes urban, because I
Yeah.
feel that a lot of construction management researchers look at the projects, but they forget to contextualize that within an urban area. So I like to kind of bring the communities of urban studies and construction together. So I think that in construction management and economics, at least we are very clear that we actually want to take a much more systemic process of understanding the whole life cycle of construction, right the way through from not just on-site production, but also the through life services. And we want to do that theoretically. We do not tend to publish papers that simply produce a model for practitioners to use, because what we also find is that a lot of these models don't tend to get used by practitioners either. And there are a lot of journals that actually deal with that. And one way you can look at that is in a lot of systematic reviews, the number of models related papers don't tend to get cited very much either. So, you can already see whether it delivers an impact or not. I'd like to have a conversation with other editors in chief to say, okay, how can we differentiate ourselves? And I think we do. I think there's a journal that focuses primarily on developing countries, for instance. There are journals that have a much more engineering focus. Um, then there are those that look at the intersections between engineering, construction, and architecture, for example. But I really like to learn from the management studies people, because there also you see a lot of different journals, and then some journals have a critical flavor, other journals focus on strategy, so I would like us to mature to that level also.
Thank you very much, Paul. And you are right, these special issues that recently introduced by yourself is great because it reflects the dynamism in the field of construction. Thank you very much, Paul. I understand other colleagues have questions, so thanks a lot. I will listen to the conversation onwards. Thank you.
Professor Paul, this is Tarun from India. Thank you for the presentation, and it is excellent to listen to you on this particular presentation. Though I read your piece when it is released, it is really interesting to hear firsthand from you. Thank you very much. And maybe can you throw some light on the aspect of theoretical contribution? And you have anchored well with an illustration. Probably you can do that for the theoretical contribution as well for our benefit. Thank you.
Okay, so what I would say is that normally we do a literature review, but I really don't like the term literature review because as a supervisor, I find that my PhDs also get confused. What is the literature review? Now, remember when I have the hourglass, you normally see citations of references in the review of previous studies for sure. You also see citations in the theory section, and you also see citations in the method section. Generally, you don't see citations in the results section, and in the discussion and conclusions, you also see citations. So these are kind of signals. But then my PhDs often say, oh, it's a citation, so it must be a literature review. And I say, no, there are different types of reviews that you do. And what generally happens in our field is that a lot of researchers simply review previous studies to handpick a whole bunch of factors that they either do a survey or an interview, and then in the end, they confirm those factors are important. And that really doesn't move the conversations forward. So I always distinguish between two things. The first is the review of previous studies. I know it's a mouthful, but I force my PhDs to say review of previous studies. Because if you see from my example, recently there's been growing concern about why there are so few women in construction. Most studies tend to be done by women, with women, for women, just as an example. However, what is overlooked is the views of men. What I'm doing is I'm not picking out factors, but I'm challenging the previous research questions. So the review of previous studies is to give you the basis, the justification to convince us that your research question is really interesting and important. Once you have that question, then the theory is going to explain the terms that you use in that question. So nowadays, for instance, a lot of people are interested in sustainability. But what do you mean by sustainability? Then the theory bit serves a different function. It serves the function of explaining the terms that you use in the question. So all the factors type stuff should go into the theory bit, not the review of previous studies. I'm not sure if this is clear enough, but what I would say is anything before the research question, you use the literature to help you justify why we need to ask that question. Whereas in the theory part, it is to explain the words that you use in the question. Because actually, in any academic research, we are always interested in a whole bunch of concepts, what they are, and also how the concepts relate to one another. So when you explain the concepts and their relationships, that's the theory bit. That's an explaining function. The review bit is actually a justification. So if you want to create a good impact, then I would really pay attention on a particular topic area. What did previous researchers ask? What methods did they use? What conclusions did they make? And then to say what is missing in that piece so that it justifies your question. That's usually very difficult to do. And I must say that usually in the first draft of the papers, usually the review is not there. There's always a lot of whole bunch of factors, but that's mainly theory. And the review, the contextualizing bit as to why we need to ask a question, is usually missing or not very developed.
Paul, thank you so much. There's some folks texting in the chat area, and I know there's some folks with their hands up as well too. Let's go to first on my screen is Duga with his hand up, I believe.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi Paul. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was quite interesting. Yeah, just a little question. I'm looking at the academic paper as a chain of conversation. In the area of inviting future conversations, the discussion aspect is very specific. What are the expectations that a writer or an author should concentrate in writing those discussion piece of the research? Thank you.
Okay, so usually in the first draft, I'm also an author, and usually when I get to the discussion and conclusions in the first draft, I get so fed up with myself that, you know, you just want to submit and then forget about it. So usually the discussion and conclusions are not very developed, and that's not grounds for a reject. Basically, what you need to do in the discussion of the findings is first of all really emphasize what is the new added value that you have brought to the table. And you do that by comparing your findings with the findings of previous studies. That's why I use review of previous studies. Because when you review previous studies, you can then say, oh, all these people have found this, and what I found is surprising, is remarkable, is different from what they find. Usually, when we read discussions, the authors always say, oh, I found these, and this confirmed the literature. So I'm thinking, if it simply supports what we already know, then what is new, right? So first of all, really emphasize what is different in your findings. And then you can identify, okay, now that you've plugged the gap, what else do we need to know? So for instance, when I found that men and women share similar experiences, I cannot conclude that men and women are equal, but this then triggers maybe some further questions in my head. And as a new researcher in any field, we often read the discussion and conclusions to figure out, okay, what are the new research questions that are motivating the field? So I think that that's also of tremendous impact if we can spend some time, at least during the revisions, to really think carefully, because it's a strategic choice that you make, what kinds of future conversations you want to invite. So I would really spend some time really investing in that, but maybe not in the first draft because we're always very tired by that time.
Great advice, Paul. I think on my list, how it's coming up, Mohammed is next with the hand up.
Hello, good morning, Paul. Thanks a lot, Michael. Good to see you, Paul. Last time I spoke to you in person, I was still doing my PhD. That was a few years ago, and it's been quite a while now since that finished. One of the things that and thanks a lot for the presentation, very insightful, really. One of the things I'm really interested to know here, and it's not much of an angle that really is contributing or not contributing to the acceptance of the paper, but from your, from experience, would new papers that pretty much, I'm not going to say outside the scope of CMNE journal, but do not follow the usual thread, if that makes sense, as in a little bit outside the norm. For example, very much facilities management oriented, let's say, or post-construction oriented. And do such papers, for example, have such a high acceptance rate? And my other question is, for papers, in order for them to at least progress or have, for example, a higher rate of acceptability, would the tendency be to cite more paper from CMNE journal? And thank you very much.
Okay, So remember, academic papers are part of a chain of conversation. Therefore, we would expect you to also engage with the conversations that we publish in our journal. So
Okay.
let me give an example. Building information modeling is of interest to so many journals, but in CM&E, we are very interested in the organizational aspects of building information modeling. You know, what are some of the challenges in making it work? What are some of the new collaborations, new processes that need to be in place, etc. And so if you see some of our published papers on BIM, indeed, we are very interested in what happens at the organizational level. So if you then submit a paper on BIM that only focuses on, let's say, the ontologies, let's say, then it doesn't really make sense. Or, you know, you're creating a BIM library of some sort, then that's not really connecting with our conversations. So I think that that is important. In terms of facilities management, the question, I must say that we don't get very many papers on that area, maybe because the authors think it's not relevant. And of all the papers that are submitted on that area, if they are able to connect that back to construction somehow, then we generally accept them. So I think that's not a problem at all. Yeah. If you are in doubt, always send the editor-in-chief an email because editor-in-chiefs do enjoy speaking to prospective authors also.
That was going to be my next question, Paul. Thank you. So
Yeah.
to initiate that conversation, would I be sending just, you know, an informal inquiry, or would it be some sort of an extended abstract before submitting the full
Well,
paper?
just, yeah, you're shaping your thoughts, so 2 lines is fine, and then we can have a conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
nowadays, editors and reviewers are also part of that conversation. No longer is the editor the judge of papers, but we often facilitate conversations between authors and reviewers also.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And good to see you again. Thank you.
That is very helpful, Paul. Thank you so much. That's great advice. Next is Alif.
Yes. Hi, Paul. Thanks for a very, very good presentation. I'm Anne Filsen from Norway, and I have a question about multidisciplinary research because I see that as a challenge because it's very easy to fall between the chairs. Have you some good tips or advice to give us? Because I see that you are trying to start a new conversation, and you also foresee arguments for foresee maybe some missing elements that you hadn't found, or some new combination that you want to explore further. So do you have some advice on that? It will be helpful. Thank you.
I would say that construction is generally a multidisciplinary field anyway. So, you know, we have sociologists, psychologists, economics, you can even have history, etc., etc. I mean, the possibilities are limitless. But what I would say is that you are the author, so make a strategic choice as to who you want to have a conversation with. And one way to do that is do not put in an alphabet soup of theories and be very strict with the number of concepts you introduce. I always say that a good research question generally tries to connect a number of concepts together and try to go for two to start with. Don't put more than two because the more you put in, the more you don't get specificity in terms of what you're looking at. And then the more you will invite criticisms because people will say, when you talk about energy, are you coming in from a physics point of view or a sociologist point of view or whatever? So make a very clear choice. Also indicate that through your citations of references. And particularly for novice researchers, whenever you read something, there is always a temptation to want to include everything you've read in your list of references. Don't do that because remember, academics operate in tribes. When you go to conferences, you see groups of people that never talk to each other. And likewise, they never cite each other. So it is for you in this journey to figure out, is my conversation a sociological one or a psychological one or a historical one. And then be very specific. And then, of course, you have some oddballs who are in between, right? So you have social psychology, and but then you're very clear that that is exactly the domain you want to have a conversation with. And if the reviewer comes back and say, oh, why you didn't look at that or this or the other, then you come back and say, I'm aware of that, but this is outside the scope. By the way, you can then add a sentence or two in the discussion of findings to say, I've taken a sociological slant to things, but maybe if I looked at it psychologically, this could be further research. So be very clear, don't have too many concepts, and don't just put in all the references. Make sure you have that tightness in terms of your definition.
That is great advice. I think our next question comes from Bashir.
Hi, Professor Shak. Thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding, it's going to be in two sections. I mean, I've read one of your editorials, and then I've sent a couple of emails when you're discussing about using theory to, rather than just bring about different variables. If you're using quantitative, for example, so you mentioned in those editorials about especially you specifically talk about challenging the existing knowledge to bring your research questions. So I'm trying to ask you, how can we link that to, say, building on the existing knowledge to develop your research question? And when you said we should challenge, the journal prefer to challenge you to challenge the existing knowledge to come about research question. That is number one. My question number two, goes to specifically to the number of reviewers used by CME, sometimes like 6 reviewers. And often sometimes you look at all of the comment, I'm trying to understand why specifically 6 reviewers, and sometimes they quite of different things they ask you to do when you're reviewing. Is there anything why CME decided to be using 6 reviewers? Whereas even some of those contemporary Q1 like GCM or IGPM, they just use 3. If you can clarify that, thank you very much.
Yeah. So maybe I take the reviewer's question first. Indeed, sometimes I wonder whether we should just have 2 reviewers. But in CME, we generally need 3 reviewers' comments. But sometimes we will live with 2 if they are very good comments. What do I mean by good? Good means that the reviewers really engage with the paper and really add value in their comments. And sometimes we get reviewers because of one reason or another who don't have the time to invest in giving comments, and they give very, very short statements. And to us, it doesn't help the authors develop the thinking further. So we generally ask for 3. 6 is quite rare. Just to give you an idea, we typically invite about 10 people just to get 3 reviews. And we have ever gone up to 17, and the highest we ever invited was 55, just to get 3. Because, don't forget, the academic year is also quite lumpy. There are certain times of the year when we're always marking or doing teaching, etc. And then we need holidays too. So, people are not always available to review. And then sometimes we get the reviewers' comments, and then they disagree with one another. So to play on the safe side, we invite a 4th. So that's also the reason. But yeah, generally we try to give as much constructive comments. And if we don't, the editors also then add, sometimes the editors' comments are longer than the reviewers' comments. So pay attention to that also. The other thing you asked was, how do I make a contribution in theory? So my quick answer to that is, don't just cite the theory. There's a lot of people who simply name drop a theory, but they don't really go deep and do a deep dive. So what I would say, and in my editorial, I also cited Steve Barley, who said that in a paper, you haven't got space to make a theoretical contribution. you can maybe challenge a perspective in that theory. So be very specific. Don't just say, well, I'm going to, I don't know, this is my contribution to the whole of institutional theory. Well, that's not possible because institutional theory has so many different camps. It has so many different aspects. So what particular aspect? So what I would say is do a good review of previous studies, really unpack past questions, past methods, past findings. Find the patterns of what we know in those areas, and then I think you will find your irritation or the points that you are not really satisfied with previous scholarship, and then that is your gap. Frame the gap as tightly as you can, because you're not going to change the world. This is not a Nobel Prize. In fact, most Nobel Prize papers have been rejected at some point or another as well. So I hope that answers your question on the theoretical contribution.
Yes, thank you.
Rashid is next.
Uh, Thank you. My question is related to methodology aspect in papers. Like what we see recently, mostly construction project management journals have put more focus on computing, digital technology, and BIM related topics. The main reason is like that such papers put more, such methodologies put more cosmetics inside in form of colorful images, tables, and even mostly readers in construction management don't understand such methodologies, but still main focus has changed from problem to methodologies. So in that sense, what about for those readers who have followed Muller and Turner, P.D. Love, and A.K. Livagnon? For those who have followed theoretical aspect in construction management, the room of publication remain quite less in such high-ranked journals. So where do you see like your journal falls in that regard?
Yeah, and I think this is also a general development in journals in all fields. I think that, if you ask a PhD researcher to read a paper and then to really reproduce the method, I think a lot of people will really struggle. And nowadays, I think a lot of journals are really pushing on, really explaining the method. So indeed, that is also usually the point where reviewers will ask, well, how did you do it? Because if we cannot understand it, then it's very difficult to assess the validity and the reliability of what you have found. So indeed, I think the method, we can only get better, I think. I think if we reflect back to 20 years ago, I think we are much more sophisticated in our way of theorizing, but also in our method explanation. And I also saw in the chat a very interesting point made by Pekka Huovinen, that indeed your empirical findings will become very outdated. And that's why in CME, we focus also on what is the theoretical contribution. Because what you need to do is to take that empirical context and those findings and say, well, what are some of the fundamental lessons that we learn that are more durable? And I think that this is what really creates an impact in the ways we think, in the ways we challenge ourselves to think about issues and problems. So yeah, so I think more elaboration on the method so that people can reproduce. I think in our field we have a lot of is there such a word, reproducible studies, because the methods are just not elaborate enough.
Paul, I know we're coming to the top of the hour. Do we have time for maybe one more question? And then, Io has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Paul, for sparing time. My question is regarding theorizing the field of construction management and economics. Remember in the CME journal in the early 90s, there was a debate among scholars on the theorizing of the field, and the debate dovetailed into the choices of methodology, whether to use qualitative methodology or quantitative methodology or the mixture of both. But today you've mentioned about the field being an interdisciplinary field. So does that mean that the field cannot have a theory of its own, or it's just not ripe as a field to, to have a theory? And because, as you've been mentioning, the importance of theory in the research that we do. So just to have your views on that.
Yeah. Oh, where do I start? I think it depends on how you define theory. That's one. But I would say that there are many, many theories that are developed. For instance, the theory of the firm by this Coase in the 1930s. People have then looked at that and then said, well, it doesn't really apply to construction. And in construction, maybe we have a different form of administration. So we have other scholars in the 1980s, Eccles, for instance. And these are kind of theoretical perspectives which are actually developed outside of construction, which we regularly cite now when we talk about transaction costs or the economics of construction. So what I would say is that theory is simply the way we think about something. So the first thing you have to figure out is, what is that something that you are interested in looking at? And how do you see that something? So I'm not going to use these big words like ontology and epistemology, but basically that means I'm looking at this, right? I'm looking at the site or a concrete mixer or maybe a sensor or a spreadsheet. What am I looking at? And what theories can help me explain what I'm seeing? So I think that that is a much sort of deeper sophistication in terms of theorizing. And then the quantitative qualitative debate, I think we've gone past that now. Of course, if you are a new PhD, then of course this still bothers you. But what I would say is it really depends, again, on what question are you trying to answer. If you are answering a what question, a how much question, to what extent question, then those questions are best sorted out using quantitative methods. If you are looking at a how question or a why question, then maybe qualitative research is more helpful. And then, of course, you have a lot of grace in between. So I think that's important. Maybe my final point, Michael, I see we're running out of time. Somebody asked, should I do a review systematically or not? It's really interesting. Suddenly, people are interested in systematic reviews, but now I'm beginning to see papers that say we don't have to be systematic. So remember, it's all part of a conversation, and the conversations always go round and round over time. So with that, I hope that was helpful.
Paul, I think this was an absolutely wonderful conversation. I apologize to those folks in text chat who've been texting me both privately and in the text chat that we did not get a chance. I think we need to have you back, Paul, for another hour at some point in the future. I know that Don Ward, CIB's Chief Executive Officer, would like to say some closing remarks and give his thanks. So Don?
Thanks, Michael. Hi, Paul. And yeah, just a big thank you from CIB for your content today. CM&E is one of only 3 CIB recognized journals, and you've demonstrated today why it deserves that eminence. Paul has shown us why he's such an important and valued source of advice to us and to me personally in CIB in the development of our work in this area. And yeah, but you prepared well for that presentation, Paul. That was very clear. And I do think that the more than 70 participants that we had online today, and probably many more who'll get to watch the recorded version later on, I hope, they all, we all heard tremendous content from you for researchers. And as Mike said, not just for PhD students or for early career researchers, but I think anybody who watched today will have benefited from that time. I thought you gave some great answers to some very good and relevant questions that we had from our participants, and again showed which themselves showed where people value advice in this area. So in summary, yes, a massive thank you from the CIB for today, and I hope you benefit from better paper submissions and greater future impact of the journal as well. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, everybody. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. We will put this recording onto our CIB's website and then, of course, onto our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.